The Memphian Theater sat at 51 Cooper Street in Midtown Memphis, a neighborhood movie house with a faded marquee and worn velvet seats that had been open since the 1930s. By 1974, it was not especially remarkable. Not the grandest cinema in Memphis, not the newest, just a neighborhood theater that showed whatever the distributor sent and kept its doors open on the strength of habit and the quiet loyalty of people who lived nearby. But on certain nights, something different happened there. After the last regular screening ended and the lobby emptied, the phone would ring. A soft-voiced man would identify himself as an employee of Elvis Presley. He would explain that Mr. Presley was interested in renting the theater for a private screening. He would offer a figure that the manager, a man named Russell who had worked the same building for 22 years, found impossible to refuse. The arrangement was simple. The theater stayed open past midnight. Elvis would arrive with his people, watch whatever films he chose, and leave before dawn. The money was paid in cash. Nobody asked to sign anything. Russell told almost no one. Elvis Presley had been coming to the Memphian this way since the late 1960s, using it as a private sanctuary in a city where his face was so well known that a simple trip to the cinema had become impossible. He was 39 years old in the autumn of 1974, and he had not sat in a public movie theater with strangers around him in nearly 15 years. The last time he had tried, somewhere in the early 1960s, a whisper had spread through the theater within minutes. By the time the opening credits rolled, the situation was unmanageable. Women climbed over seats. A man asked for his autograph on a napkin. Someone photographed him from the row behind with a flash, and the explosion of light in the dark frightened him in a way he didn't like to think about. After that, he had stopped trying. The Memphian was the compromise. His compromise. The thing he had arranged for himself when ordinary pleasures were no longer available in ordinary ways. He could not sit in the dark with strangers and disappear into a story for 2 hours, but he could do this. Rent the whole building, fill it with people he chose, and approximate the experience well enough that the longing for it didn't become unbearable. He always brought too many people. That was what those who knew him best remembered about the Memphian nights. He would invite the core group, Red West, Jerry Schilling, Charlie Hodge, and then keep calling. Friends of friends. People he had met briefly and liked. The invitations went out after midnight, waking people from sleep, and most came anyway because it was Elvis calling, and because the offer was genuinely generous. Free movies in a private theater, all the popcorn you wanted, the strange intimacy of being somewhere you weren't supposed to be after hours. By October 14th, a Monday, the weather had turned. Memphis autumn was a slow orange thing, the light carrying some quality of lateness that Elvis had always found both beautiful and vaguely threatening. He had been back in Memphis 3 weeks after a demanding run of shows through the South, and the rest had not restored him the way rest was supposed to. He was tired. Not the tiredness that sleep fixed. The other kind. He had been performing since he was 19. By 40, the math was staggering. Thousands of concerts, hundreds of thousands of miles, more stages than he could have named. The touring had become its own kind of weather, something he moved through rather than chose. The jumpsuits, the spotlights, the roar of crowds that sometimes reached a pitch that felt less like applause and more like pressure. All of it had accumulated into a weight he carried and did not discuss. He called Charlie Hodge at 11:30 and said he was thinking about going to the Memphian. Charlie said he would be there. He called Red West next. 3 more calls. By 12:30, 7 people were gathered in the lobby. The projectionist that night was a 23-year-old named Dennis Cooper. 2 years on the job. He had run the projector for perhaps a dozen of Elvis's screenings and had learned quickly, without being told, simply from reading the room, that Elvis did not want anyone making a production of his presence. He was there to watch movies, not to be watched. Dennis had adapted accordingly, which was why Russell trusted him with these nights. Before midnight, Dennis had prepared 2 reels. Cheese 'em, the 1970 John Wayne Western that Elvis had seen before and asked for again, followed by a newer release. He had also, quietly, placed a fresh bag of popcorn and a cold Pepsi on the armrest of the center aisle seat in the third row, the seat Elvis always chose, the same one every time. Elvis noticed the Pepsi when he sat down. He paused just briefly. Something in his expression shifted. Not quite a smile, but a softening. He sat without saying anything about it. The lights went down. The projector beam cut through the dark. The movie began. For the first hour, things were as they usually were. The group occupied the front rows, scattered informally, the easy texture of people who spent a lot of time together in small rooms, occasional low laughter, a whispered remark, the ordinary rhythm of watching a film with people you know well. Elvis was quieter than usual, present, but distant, watching from somewhere slightly farther back than his seat. About 40 minutes into the first film, the door at the back of the theater opened. Dennis heard it from the booth, the faint mechanical sound of the heavy fire door. He glanced through the porthole window. One of the group had stepped out to the lobby minutes earlier. He assumed it was him returning. It wasn't. It was a girl. She was perhaps 11 or 12, dressed in a school coat slightly too large for her, carrying a paper bag from a fast food place on Cooper Street. She stood at the back of the theater with the careful stillness of someone who has walked into a place and immediately understood that something is different from what they expected. She had come through a fire exit propped open on a warm afternoon weeks earlier and never properly relatched, a small lapse that had gone unnoticed until now. She had tried the door, found it open, and walked in. She stood at the back and looked at the screen. John Wayne moved across it in wide shot, the New Mexico landscape enormous behind him. She watched for a moment, then looked at the people in the seats, then back at the screen, and she made the decision that children sometimes make, the one that adults tend to overthink out of existence, to simply stay, at least for a while, and see what happened. She sat down in the last row and put her paper bag on the seat beside her. From the booth, Dennis watched this. His job, strictly speaking, was to stop the film and alert someone. There was a child in the theater who had no business being there. It was close to 1 in the morning, but something made him hesitate. She was sitting with the focused absorption of someone watching something they love. She was in the last row, well behind the group. He decided to wait. 7 minutes passed. Red West, turning to say something to the man beside him, glanced toward the back. He went still. He looked at the booth, then at the girl, then back at the booth. Dennis made a small gesture. Wait. Red turned back to the screen and said nothing. The girl was eating French fries and watching the movie with complete contentment, as if a private screening room at 1 in the morning were an entirely normal place to be. Elvis had not moved, had not turned around. He was watching with the same quiet concentration he had brought to the whole evening, and then something on screen lost his attention for a moment. A shift in pacing, or simply the natural wandering of a tired mind, and he turned his head the way people do when their eyes want something other than what they have been looking at. He saw the girl. He looked at her for what Dennis estimated was about 10 seconds. From the booth, it was impossible to read the expression precisely, but the posture was what Dennis remembered afterward. The slight forward lean, the stillness, the quality of attention that was different from an ordinary glance. Elvis turned back to the screen. 2 minutes later, he stood up. He said nothing to the group. He moved along the row and walked up the aisle toward the back. His footsteps were quiet. The movie covered whatever sound he made. He reached the last row and sat down 1 seat away from the girl, leaving a single empty seat between them. She looked at him. He looked at the screen. She looked at the screen. Whatever she felt in that moment, recognition or confusion or the particular mixture of both that comes when something expected turns out to be real, she did not run, did not speak, did not do any of the things an adult might have done. She watched the movie. She ate another French fry. After a minute, Elvis said something. Dennis could not hear it from the booth. He could only see the shape of it, the slight turn of Elvis's head, the brief movement of his mouth. The girl looked at him and said something back. One sentence, maybe. Then they both returned to the screen. This was how they sat for the remainder of the first film. One seat apart. Occasionally one of them said something. Always quietly. Always brief. Always followed by a return to the movie. The group in front had noticed that Elvis was gone, but no one turned around, or if they had made the quiet decision that people who know someone well sometimes make, not to disturb whatever was happening. When the first film ended and the house lights came up for intermission, Elvis said something longer to the girl. A question, by the shape of it. She answered. He nodded. He looked at the paper bag on the seat beside her. Then he stood up and walked back down the aisle toward the lobby. Hands in his pockets, unhurried. 3 minutes later, he returned. He was carrying a bag of popcorn and a Pepsi. He sat back down in the same seat. He placed the popcorn on the armrest between the empty seat and the girl's seat, positioned so she could reach it easily. He set the Pepsi on the floor beside her foot. She looked at him. He looked at the screen. The second film began. They watched it to the end. When the credits finished and the lights came fully up, Elvis stood. He looked at the girl for a moment. Something private in that look. Something the group, finally turning to see what was there, could read in his posture but not in his face. He said a few words. She nodded. He reached into his jacket pocket, produced a business card, and handed it to her. Said something else. Then he walked down the aisle and back to the group. Nobody asked him anything. They gathered their jackets and filed into the October air. The girl remained in her seat until they had gone. Dennis found her there when he came down to close up. She was still holding the business card. He asked if she was all right. She said yes. He asked how she had gotten in. She told him about the door. He asked if she had somewhere to go. She said she lived 2 blocks away. She showed him what Elvis had written on the back of the card. A phone number, with a short instruction to call if she was ever in trouble. Not a gesture, not a performance, just a phone number, written in blue pen, given to a child who had walked in out of the dark. Dennis walked her to the front of the building and watched her go. She moved without fear, the easy confidence of a kid who knew where she was. He thought about that night many times in the years that followed. He couldn't explain it in a way that captured what it actually was. It wasn't dramatic. There was no music, no grand moment. A famous man had noticed a child sitting alone in a dark room after midnight. He had walked up the aisle and sat near her. He had brought her popcorn. They had watched a movie together. That was all. And yet Dennis couldn't shake the feeling that something real had happened. Something true, in a way that the larger, louder moments of a famous life very rarely are. Charlie Hodge mentioned it in an interview decades later. Elvis had not brought it up on the drive home. Somewhere on Union Avenue, quietly, almost to himself, he had said, "Did you see her eating those fries? She was watching that movie like it was the best thing she'd ever seen." Charlie said yes, and that was all Elvis said about it. What those closest to Elvis understood, and what those who knew him only from a distance rarely grasped, was that his generosity was rarely about the gesture itself. The cars he bought for strangers, the cash pressed into hands, the midnight calls, and 100 small improvisational kindnesses, these were not performances. They were the actions of a man who understood, very deeply, what it felt like to have nothing, and who could never quite make peace with having everything. The girl in the last row had not asked for anything. She had walked in out of the dark and sat down to watch a movie, with a bag of French fries and the unassuming ease of a child who believed she was allowed to take up space in the world. There was something in that, in her quiet, in the complete absence of any wish to be recognized or treated specially, that reached him in a way the screaming crowds never did. He had spent 15 years surrounded by people who wanted something from him, who loved him loudly, with a fervor that was flattering and also exhausting. He had become a screen onto which other people projected their longing. They didn't see him. They saw the thing he represented for them. The girl in the last row didn't know what he represented. Or if she did, if she had recognized him and chosen to say nothing, then she had made the gentle decision to treat him like a person rather than a phenomenon. Either way, the result was the same. An hour of company in which he was not the king of rock and roll, not the legend, not the icon. He was just someone a few seats away, eating popcorn in the dark. Elvis continued renting the Memphian until near the end of his life. Those who were with him on those nights described them as among the times he seemed most at ease, laughing more freely, talking more naturally, being, as one of them put it, just a person. Dennis Cooper worked at the Memphian until it closed in the late 1970s. When he finally spoke about that Monday night years later, he kept returning to the same image, the same detail, the one that stayed with him through everything else. He didn't make it a big deal. He just went and sat near her. That's what I remember. He just went and sat near her. The Memphian Theater was demolished in 1981. The land became a parking lot, then a small commercial building, then nothing in particular. The kind of unremarkable space that gives no indication of what it once was. But somewhere, perhaps in a drawer in a house in Midtown Memphis, there is a business card with a phone number written on the back in blue pen. Or perhaps it was lost long ago, the way small things are lost, casually, without ceremony, in the ordinary course of living. What remains is the story. A tired man in a dark theater. A child with a bag of French fries. The quiet decision to close the distance by a few seats. The simple, unremarkable, completely human gesture of bringing someone popcorn and sitting beside them in the dark. These are the things that don't make it into the biographies. The things that don't appear on album covers or in the documentaries with their sweeping scores and their reverent narration about the birth of rock and roll. These are the things that happen between all of that. Not the legend, not the phenomenon, not the king, just a man in a movie theater, one seat away from someone who needed nothing from him, and choosing, for that reason, to stay.